For at least a few years, God has been really, really working in my heart in this area. And I want to project that onto you today, because I think that it doesn't matter if you're young or you are the most seasoned that we have here in the church. This is applicable to you in every way. For some of you, you won't understand this from a personal perspective, but you'll be able to understand it from a looking forward perspective. For others of you, you might be at the age that I'm at, maybe you're in your 50s, and you're able to kind of, maybe you're living in this right now, and then there are some of you that will grasp a hold of this in your seasoned part of your life, and you know exactly what I'm talking about. Now, before I do that, we have been very careful in this particular series going through the story of Abraham, or Abram, up to this point. But today we're going to get to change his name. Not us, but God does. But what we're going to see in the life of Abraham is a timeline that Moses, remember this is Moses that is writing, and he is helping Israel to understand more about where they came from. The timeline is extremely important for us to pay attention to, because all of our tendency, and mine included, when we read through the Bible, is when we turn the page, or we turn from one chapter to the next, we just think this is immediately after, or this is the next day, or this is the next month, or rare cases, sometimes it's the next year. But the timeline in this whole thing is extremely important, and I want us to we're going to have to do some math. I hate math. Apologize if you're a math teacher in here. I'll never love math. And if you're a math teacher and you go, you always use this in your life. And the answer to that is yes, but I also have a calculator, and now I have it on my phone. So what my teacher said when they were young, they were lying. They just didn't know about the advancement of technology, okay? Anybody a math teacher in here? All right, so I expect to get an email from you, Jason, sorry. Stay with math, all right? So here's the timeline we're looking at, okay? We're going to review some of the highlights of Abraham's story, but really pay attention to timeline. First of all, we saw that Abram and Sarah were married, but she could not conceive. We saw that at the tail end of Genesis chapter 11. Secondly, when Abram was 75 years old, he received 3 promises from God. And those promises were what? Number 1? Okay, we got to wake up. Number 1 was what? Number 2? Number 3? And that blessing would be to all families of the earth. And ultimately, that blessing will be fulfilled in the person of who? Jesus. So land, nation, and blessing. So he was 75 years old when God came to him and made this promise. Now, in Genesis chapter 12, the latter half of that chapter, there was a famine in Canaan where they were living at that time, and it caused them to go to Egypt. But Abram had his wife Sarai lie about their relationship because he didn't trust that God could protect them, and ultimately couldn't keep his promises. That's what Abram believed. And then we saw in Genesis chapter 15 that when Abram was 85 years old, he was at a breaking point, and he had been promised a land, nation, and blessing. And ultimately, one of the major things that we followed, the storyline that we followed, is the fact that he had no son or no descendants to speak of. So a land would be easy to get, but when it comes to from you nations would come, or descendants, or a blessing would come through your descendants, well, he just didn't have anybody yet. And so his wife couldn't conceive. And this was kind of a wrestling match back and forth in Abram's faith. So we see this happening. At 85 years old, he was just at this breaking point, wondering if God could keep his promises. And we saw kind of what we would describe maybe from our culture as a bizarre vision, and something that God did to confirm these promises to him. And you can read all about that in Genesis chapter 15. But to kind of sum it all up, God swore on himself. It wasn't a covenant between God and then also Abraham would keep his part, but God swore on himself that these promises that he made, regardless of what Abraham would do, God would keep these promises. Well, not long after God made this unbreakable covenant and confirmed and swore on himself, Sarai, Abram's wife, convinced Abram that they needed to make their own way to fulfill this promise. And that way, again, you can go back in Genesis chapter 16, but you'll find that when Abram was 86 years old, he conceived Ishmael with Sarai's servant, Hagar. But he, speaking of Ishmael, was not the son of God's promise. So, a lot of numbers there, so I'm going to help us do the math. Because when we turn the page from Genesis 16 to where we're at today, Genesis 17, Abram is now 99 years old. And just for sake of reference here, Abram dies. Does anybody know how old he is when he dies? Anybody? 175 years old. So again, he's past midlife here for sure. But what we're seeing in Genesis 17, turning the page from 16 to 17, he's now 99 years old. So you're in Genesis chapter 17, verse 1, it says, when Abram was 99 years old. So we're going to do some math here, and I need you to follow me. So even if you hate math like me, math is super important here. It had been 11 years, okay, from the time of the promise until the Abram, Hagar, and Ishmael incident. 75 years old when he received the promise, and then he got frustrated. They both did. Abram and Sarah both got frustrated and decided they were going to fulfill this promise in their own way. And Sarai gave her servant Hagar to Abram to sleep with so that they could have a child, quote unquote, a child together, culturally speaking, to fulfill this promise that God had made. But this was not God's plan. So it had been 11 years from the time of the promise until this Abram, Hagar, and Ishmael incident. And then, again, keeping the math in perspective here, then 13 years from that incident, we have Genesis 17. So God's promise of descendants through a son had not been fulfilled. And let's do the totality of the math here. It had been 24 years without a son for Abram and Sarah. A long time. Now, again, there's people that live to 100 years old or a little over 100 years old. That's not real common. Don't you hate it when you see things on TV? They're like, you know, how did you make it to 100? They're like, well, I drank wine every day and I smoked. I'm just being sarcastic here. I ate whatever I wanted to, and you're just like, what is going on? Have you ever watched any documentaries of centurions and where they are in the world? It's quite interesting if you find some of those documentaries. I'm being obviously sarcastic there. But most people in our world don't make it to 100 years old. So here you are, and you're looking at a 24-year span without a son for Abram and Sarai. And at this point, their reaction to God's promises was likely twofold, and I would even propose maybe threefold. But they were thinking at this point, number one, God isn't going to do this. Or number two, or God must do what is humanly impossible. Now, there could be a third option too, and that is they will try to make another way for God's plan to be carried out. But what we find here in Genesis 17 is that God buckles down on his promise. After 24 years of this particular part of the promise not being fulfilled, you would just think they're over and over what we see is Abram and Sarai are just trying to get God to relinquish that he's not able to do this. And they try to create all these solutions and all these ways to kind of give God an out concerning the promises that he's made. And I'll have to agree, after 24 years, kind of frustrating. You know that God said something along the way. He's giving you these promises, these kind of highlights in your life, the part that you would want to post on your Facebook story and come up in your memories. God made this promise. He came back to me. He confirmed this, or he reaffirmed this. But as of yet, nothing had been done. So what we find, first of all, in Genesis 17 is that God reaffirms his Genesis 12 covenant with Abram. Now, I don't know if you're like me, but there's a part of me that's like, okay, this is too little, too late. It's not like it's been just a year or even a decade. It has been almost 2.5 decades since the promise was made. So the frustration that God had not delivered in the time that they felt things should be delivered by, it became just this point of where they just probably didn't believe that God would ever accomplish it in the way that he said. But let's take a look at Genesis 17, verse 1 through the beginning of verse 3. It says, when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord, let me just stop there. This is the first use of, so when you look at the Hebrew language, that name for God there is El Shaddai, and that means God Almighty, and it refers to either his ability to supply something abundantly or possibly to his majestic strength. So this name that Moses uses concerning God refers that he's able to provide, or he's a strong or all-powerful God. So Abram was 99 years old. The Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you and may multiply you greatly. Then Abram fell on his face. Now there's something in my heart and mind here that I guess humanly speaking, has a hard time ignoring the 13 years that nothing happened. I love what Charles Spurgeon says. He said, all these 13 years, as far as Scripture informs us, Abram didn't have a single visit from God. We don't find any record of him doing anything memorable or having so much as a single audience with the Most High. Now, during these 13 years, certainly we are not aware of any mountaintop experiences. It was just, as far as we know, everyday life. Maybe even mundane, or possibly just routine. And what is frustrating is it seems that God isn't in a hurry. And Abraham, again, as far as we can tell, is just living life as normal. Eugene Peterson says, hurry is the great enemy of the spiritual life in our day. And he says you must ruthlessly eliminate hurry from your life. So is hurry really a great enemy of the spiritual life? We think that the great enemy might be, when we look at our culture today, we think that the greatest enemy, or one of the great enemies, might be, and I'm not saying that I'm not minimizing any of these things at all. But we think it might be the changing sex ethic or the redefinition of marriage. Is this a problem in our society? Absolutely. Is it the greatest enemy? Some of us think that God becoming a cosmic therapist or a divine butler is the greatest enemy. Some people think that deconstruction of their faith without reconstruction is the greatest enemy of faith. Or the rise of political religion. But I don't think hurry is on anybody's bingo card as far as the things that are onslaughting us and are great enemies of our faith journey. But I think if we think deeply about this, it resonates. How many of us, or maybe even this morning when you're asked, how have you been? You respond, busy, good, but busy. Don't you feel as if you're always moving on to the next thing without allowing your heart and mind to settle in the now or in the in-between time? You know, through fast food, internet, phones, social media, Amazon fast delivery, God thank you for that, and Netflix and streaming services, we have immediate and instant access to information, entertainment, dopamine hits, and more than that, support our hurry sickness. And this is what's concerning. And this is where I really, really need you to think, not about the person next to you, not about me, but I need you to think about you. We have been trained to expect the immediate and the instant, and it seemed to seep into our theology and our understanding of Christian discipleship. We've forgotten that God requires or expects a long obedience in the same direction. So to me, this 13 years supposed silence of God, where we don't see any memories on the Facebook wall, it's frustrating because I know that, I don't know about, maybe it's just me, but we think that everybody's just living a life that's full of highlights, memories, the things that pop up, these big things, living on the mountaintops. And I would submit to you that that's not reality. It's a reality that we've proposed to people, but it's not reality. Most of life for all of us is lived in the routine and the mundane. And what has been the enemy of that is hurry, speed. When we look at, what are the things that they highlight in the news and online? It's the fast growth of something. This person took over this business and the next year it grew by 500%. And we're just like, that's amazing. How can I repeat that in my life? When we see infomercials or things on TV, the quick way to do that or the quick way to do this or 30 days to do this, 90 days to do this, a year to do this. We're like, oh yeah, that's what I want. Something fast, something quick. When you look at the relationships in your life, all relationships struggle. And some of you think that it's just overnight that those relationships are put back together. And you might look at somebody else, your friends, or even maybe your parents or other examples of people in your life. You're just like, whoa, their relationship seems so much more healthy than ours. And maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But I think that we bought into this lie that we're supposed to be living all the time at 90 miles an hour, at the mountaintops, at the highlights, at all the memories. And I think if we're all honest, that's not where any of us live life. And so the fact that there's just 13 years, and again, this is just filling in the blanks, but it seems like God is, every time that God has interacted with Abram, we kind of get this memory to pop up on the wall. But it's not every day. It's not every month. We find that it's like 1 year to the next, or one decade to the next, that God kind of shows up in this way and talks with Abram. But my question is like, what filled that in? And I can't help, and I think we, not just Abram, but I think that we could go to any other character in the Bible and see that people's maturity is never in a hurry. And if you're an individual in this church, that maybe you sit in a Bible study, or maybe you sit in the journey, or maybe you sit in a group, and you're frustrated when you look around the table and you're like, oh, this person's so much further ahead than I am. There's no hurrying a walk of faith. There's no shortcut to a walk of faith. Well, let's notice what God does next. Verse 3, then Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, behold, my covenant is with you. And again, I can't help but thinking Abram's like, kind of like, yeah. You've been saying that for 24 years. For 24 years. I've been hearing the same thing. God, you kind of pop up every once in a while and reaffirm, reconfirm, but kind of like a yeah, I've heard that before. It says, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. Abram means exalted father, while Abraham means father of many nations. There was a name change here. Now we're skipping ahead a little bit, but if you look at verse 15 of Genesis 17, we see that Sarah's name, or Sarai's name, was changed also. Not as significant, but nonetheless still important. Verse 15, and God said to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. Sarah means princess. And from her, basically what God is saying is from her will come a royal lineage, because she will help produce nations and kings. This is a far cry from Genesis 11, where she could not bear any children. I don't know how old they were when they got married, but I just know that there was this 24 years where the promise was made, and now we're here at this place where God reaffirms his Genesis 12 covenant with Abram. And then God emphasizes this everlasting reach of the covenant. Look at verse 6. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into, and what does that next word say? What does it say? Nations. Is that part of the Genesis 12 promise? Yes. And kings shall come from you. Verse 7, and I will establish my covenant between me and you and your, what's that next word? Offspring. Is that part of the Genesis 12 promise? Yes. After you throughout their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. Verse 8, and I will give to you and to your offspring after you and what's the next word there? Land. Was that a Genesis 12 promise? Yes. Of your sojournings. All the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. But I can't get past the fact that it's 24 years. 24 years. That's a long time for God to say something is going to come to fruition, and then 2.5 decades later, God shows back up again and says, it's time. And at this point, this path that Abram and Sarah have been traveling, no doubt is fraught with frustration and anger and potentially bitterness. But I bring us back to our false belief that hurry is the key to spiritual maturity. So allow me to say something controversial. Abraham and Sarah were not lacking information or knowledge. They knew what God had said. Now, this is where it gets dicey, and I want us to think through this a little bit. In our church culture, we believe a discipleship certificate or completion of a class will mature us. Go through the journey. Go through a Bible study. Show up at church every week. We try to fast track people into maturity through information and knowledge. Learn this information, and now you're ready to pass it on to someone else who passes it on to someone else. Now, I want to back up for just a second, because I believe that knowledge and information are extremely important and necessary. But sometimes I'm concerned that we make people feel confident in the extent or the maturity of their faith when they've completed something. And my question to us is completion what we're aiming for? I don't think so. I believe it's actually just the opposite. It's wrestling through what we know to be true about God in comparison to our experience. It's the ups and downs of a relationship that help us work out our maturity. And how long does that take? A month? A year? A decade? It does take time, but it takes a lifetime. I realize not everybody in here is married, but if you're married, you're not just swapping information about each other. It's not a downloading of information. It's not like, okay, we're going to sit down at the table and you tell me something, I'm going to tell you something. Is knowing information about the other person helpful? Absolutely. Is having knowledge about the other person helpful? Absolutely it is. But that information and knowledge about the other person should cause us to learn to live in a real relationship together with that person. Information and knowledge about God should lead us to a growing love for Him over time. And I think that there are people maybe in this room that you bought in, if we just do this, do this book or do this program or do this, then it will just, it's going to change a person's life. Do things like information and knowledge have a part in people's maturity? Yes, they do. But completion of a program or a class or going through a sermon series is not the climax of a person's relationship, because Abram and Sarai had all the information that they needed concerning God's promises. And if information and knowledge is all that they needed to be mature in their faith, then what was their problem? They had not taken that information and knowledge and that learned to live in relationship with God. And I think the danger in our Christian society is we have all these things, internally, again, we love the things that we do here, programming that we do at this church. And there's even things, Parent Church, there's things like BSF. There are these Bible studies that you can do online. You can go to college. You can go to Bible college. You can even go to Bible college for free at Cedarville and take their Bible minor. But I think the danger for all of us is we think that completion of these things is a rubber stamp that now I'm mature. I've got all the information. I've got all the knowledge that's been transferred from one person to the next. And now I'm in the place where I should be. And some of you even pride yourself on where you're at theologically. And you compare yourself to other people that theologically, I'm so much, now you won't say this out loud, but maybe you sit at a Bible study or in a class and you think you're so much more mature when you listen to everybody else talk. And you consider your own knowledge compared to theirs, and you walk away from that thinking, you know what? Again, we don't say this out loud because we just don't do that, but we think we're so much mature, so much more developed than someone else just because we've completed something. When I was growing up in church, we went to this program called Awana, and I love Awana. Anybody else go to Awana? A couple of you did. Awana was great in a lot of ways. If you don't know what it is, go home, look it up. Sure, Google will tell you everything, or AI will tell you everything you need to know about Awana. But I think the danger in trusting in programs or just the download of information or knowledge into our hearts and our lives is that we would just feel this sense of completion that when I do this or when I finish this, that I am mature. And again, go back. Abram and Sarah had all the information that they needed concerning God. He made promises to them. He told them what he was going to do. And for 24 years, it didn't happen. And along the way, what do we see? We see this roller coaster of life that, you know what, is probably a lot like your life and my life. And the problem for most of us, and let me be cautious with this, is we think that there's something wrong with us. Because we're wrestling through things. Because we're having a hard time trusting God's promises. Because that maybe we don't seem as confident as the person that we're sitting beside. Or because when we go home to our families, they don't quite look like what we suppose other people's families to be like. And we begin to beat up on ourselves thinking there's something wrong with me. But our faith journey is not overnight, it's over time. And at this point, I'm not even sure that Abram and Sarai had this all figured out. Now, maybe the question for you is like, are we ever going to come to a point where we just see that Abram got it? And the answer to that, I'm going to give a spoiler here, is yes, we're going to come to a point where we see that Abram got it. But do you know how old he probably was when he finally got it? Probably about 115 or 120 years old. He did something that we'll discover in Genesis chapter 22 that tells us that he had arrived at this place where finally he trusted God so much that he was willing to do something that sounded so crazy that he probably would have never done at this point. So if you sit in here today and you don't see all these highlight reels, these mountaintop experiences, let me just say that life is not lived there. It's lived in the mundane. And I don't mean that as a negative thing, but in the mundane and the routine. And then what do we see next? We see something interesting. And that is that God requires a sign of the covenant. So he reaffirms his Genesis 12 covenant with Abram. And then in verses 9 through 14, he requires a sign of the covenant. And you'll be thankful that we're going to talk about this again. If you were here in one of our last series, we talked about this. And I promise you, we'll not belabor this point, but the sign of the covenant here is everybody's favorite topic, circumcision. But look at verse 9. And God said to Abraham, as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. Now I need you to grasp this here. For the first time, God gave Abraham something to do in regard to the covenant. He told him that his descendants must take upon themselves a sign of the covenant, showing they received the covenant by faith. And we need to make sure that we don't get this confused. Because when we look back in Genesis chapter 15, we see that Abraham believed and God accounted it to him as righteousness. But it's not until here that God asks him to do something. It was not Abraham's works that brought him into a relationship with God, but his genuine faith would lead him to good works. So what's the deal with circumcision? Again, I said I wouldn't belabor the point, but we got to give you three things that circumcision would have signified or symbolized according to the covenant. Number one, it would symbolize or signify a belonging to the physical lineage of Abraham. Secondly, and probably, I don't want to say the most important, but likely in my mind, this is the most important thing that it would have symbolized, and that is a cutting away of sin. Now, no way around this. So most kids are back there. If they're not, you can explain this to them later. But when we talk about circumcision, it is when the male organ, which carried the seed that produced sinners. So because circumcision deals with the organ of procreation, it was a reminder of the special seed of Abraham, which would ultimately bring the Messiah. So think about that. When this sign was performed, it was a cutting away, or symbolized or signified a cutting away of sin, because sin was passed on through it's middle school again, the sperm or the offspring of the man. And then we see the third thing that it symbolized or signified, and that is the setting apart of Israel from other nations. Now, I don't mean to say, I think historically we can read and see that circumcision was not exclusive to Israel, but it was something that God used with the Israelite, with this nation he was forming, to set them apart from other nations. Well, did Abraham obey this sign of the covenant? Well, we'll get to that in a second. But let's look at the last thing here, because God assures Abraham that he will do what he has promised. So, verse 16, we kind of already fast forwarded when Sarai's name was changed to Sarah. Verse 16, I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her. Then verse 17, Here's where we kind of see this kind of wrestling and the struggle. Then Abraham fell on his face, and what did he do? What does it say he did? Wow. He laughed. And said to himself, again, God knows thoughts, but this is what Abraham was saying to himself. Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Good question, right? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? So after 24 years, Abraham, I truly don't believe that his laughter in response to what God said, I truly do not believe that this is a mocking laughter of God's promise. But just a season of life thing. I really believe that his laughter was born out of the fact that he and Sarah were so old now. Could they have a child? Just to be crass, are the parts still working? And then, have you ever considered how could they raise a child at their age? And I think Abraham was the laughter wasn't a rebellious or a mocking laughter. It was just like, we're old. Almost like, God, hey, if you want to do this, you could have done this a little while ago when we were in our prime. But he was probably almost thinking kind of like, why now? Why when we're old? So look what happens next in verse 18. Because in verse 17, he said those things to himself, and then he expresses some things to God. Verse 18. And Abraham said to God, oh, that, what's that next word? Ishmael might live before you. In case you're not catching this, he's saying, God, hey, listen, we're old. Ishmael's already had some years. It'd be a lot easier, God, if that you would just take Ishmael and make this promise come through him. But God won't have any of it. In verse 19, he says, no. But Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. You know what the name Isaac means? Laughter. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. Verse 21, skip down there. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year. And then what do we find? Verse 27. And all the men of his house, those born in the house and those bought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him. So Abraham and those inside and outside his household obeyed the sign of the covenant and were circumcised. Abraham's actions, although he was somewhat doubtful along the way, he began to exercise, and I don't think these things are an oxymoron, these next two words, but he began to exercise his weak faith in God's plan. Abraham's faith began to show itself in its works. His works didn't produce faith, but because his faith was genuine, it would produce works. Can I encourage us to do something today? And I don't care how old you are, it doesn't matter. But can we reject hurry? And can we learn from each step of our journey with the Lord? Whether it's in a moment, or whether it's a long season of time. Let's model a long obedience in the same direction. You don't have it all together right now. I can guarantee you that. There's not one person in this room that has it all together, including myself. And I'm not trying to be self-help here or anything. That's okay. You are where you are right now. Now, it's possible that you are where you are right now because of disobedience or lack of faith. But you are where you are right now. But there's no fast track to wake up tomorrow morning and everything in your life just makes sense. And that's okay. It is. So what do? We don't hurry. We don't look for the next 30-day program that's going to help us come into the best relationship with Jesus that we've ever had, because that doesn't exist. It's not a 30-day, it's not a 90-day, it's not a year, not a decade, but it's a lifetime of learning to live in a relationship with God. It's taking the knowledge and information, what we know about God, and then living in relationship with Him.